And now the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. This essay is about what happens when people try to stay, not just physically, but emotionally, ethically, through rupture, discomfort, silence. It's about the small decisions that don't look like much from the outside, but quietly change the shape of a relationship. A breath held longer, a sentence not interrupted, a return that costs something. It doesn't offer steps or solutions. It doesn't wrap things up. Instead, it moves like the thing it's describing, slowly, sometimes unevenly, circling back on itself. Each section opens a space for discomfort, for reflection, for something unspoken to take shape. Some ideas repeat, some shift, some disappear. That's the rhythm of real repair. The voice doesn't instruct, it stays close to the ways we avoid and the ways we come back, close to the tension between presence and distance, between what we want to say and what we can hold. You don't need to listen in order. You don't need to hold on to every word. What matters is what catches, what lingers, what softens as you go. This essay is about the ones who try again, not because they're certain, but because they're still listening. Every theory of intimacy is secretly a theory of fear. The modern couple doesn't unravel because they speak the wrong words, but because their nervous systems have stopped believing they're safe in the presence of the other. What we call love is often just the brief suspension of self-defense. What we call conflict is often just the body remembering it has been harmed before. In this space, where desire is haunted by inherited injuries and affection coexists with unspoken grief, the work of relational repair begins not with communication, but with the recalibration of epistemic trust. There is no such thing as a neutral partner. Each arrives with a ghost, sometimes plural. These ghosts speak in the rhythm of withdrawal, in the heat of deflection, in the precise moment when silence becomes unbearable. The lovers rarely recognize them. They name them instead as flaws. You never listen, you always leave, you twist my words. But beneath these accusations is the trace of older dialogues. The parent who punished vulnerability, the culture that mistranslated need as weakness, the sibling who monopolized love. If all power is relational, then every relationship is a field of history. And still the fantasy persists that if we just say the right thing at the right time in the right tone, intimacy will return. But speech is not the root system of love. Safety is. Love thrives only when it no longer has to negotiate for its right to exist. The philosopher Judith Butler once wrote that our survival depends on a certain kind of recognition. That recognition in partnership is not cognitive, it's felt. It's the flinch that doesn't come, the breath that stays deep, the gaze that softens even in conflict. Without it, the couple does not simply miscommunicate. They dissolve into parallel worlds. Repair, then, is not a technique. It's a posture, a discipline of curiosity under threat, the refusal to win, the pause long enough to let the other come back into view, not as they should be, but as they are. In that, intimacy becomes something else. Not closeness, not compatibility. Capacity, the capacity to hold contradiction, to stay through difference, to let the story of who you were soften without erasing yourself. This isn't self-help, it's presence. A silence held long enough begins to speak, not in words, but in breath, in the shift of posture, in the moment a sentence stops halfway through and doesn't return. These are the real openings, not when something is explained, but when something that was buried gets felt for the first time. What happens next isn't clarity, it's risk. Because once something is felt, it can't be taken back. The body knows before the mind does. Repair doesn't begin with language. It begins with nervous system cues. When a voice softens, when the shoulders lower, when someone pauses before saying the thing they always say, the change is barely visible, but it registers. And when it does, something loosens. Not enough to fix things, just enough to keep going. We think of breakthroughs as realizations, but most breakthroughs don't look like that. They look like someone finally staying in the room, or someone who always fills the silence, choosing just once, not to. The philosopher Stanley Cavell suggested that in love, we are not misunderstood, we are unknowable. What matters then is not perfect understanding. It's the willingness to stay with each other in the not knowing. There's often a moment when everything slows, not dramatically, just enough. A tone changes, a pattern hesitates, the usual rhythm doesn't arrive on time. That's where something different can start. Not because anyone said the right thing, but because someone didn't move away when they usually would. That's not technique, that's presence. Presence is not the same as attention. It doesn't perform, it doesn't solve. It stays when the room gets hard to be in. That kind of staying isn't always visible, but it's felt. And when it's real, the whole room starts to change shape. Not quickly, not completely, but enough for something new to happen that couldn't before. It's tempting to ask, was that the moment things changed? But in this kind of work, change rarely announces itself. It arrives out of sequence. You only notice it looking back, when you find yourself responding differently and don't know why. That's how you know something has shifted. Not because it felt big, but because it didn't repeat. There is no emotional present without emotional history. What looks like conflict now is often just an old pattern in a new disguise, something rehearsed in childhood, or shaped by silence, or inherited from a family where repair was never modelled. The fight isn't really about dishes or tone or timing. It's about what those things signal, that we are close to something raw, something we've never had words for. Every relationship holds a choreography. Roles emerge, even when we don't mean to assign them. One person withdraws, the other pursues. One always speaks first, the other always ends the conversation. These aren't flaws, they're rehearsals. What we call incompatibility is often just two nervous systems protecting old wounds. Not until the roles are seen, really seen, can they start to loosen. Change doesn't happen when we explain these patterns. It happens when we feel them. When the one who always speaks goes quiet. When the one who hides says something they've never said out loud, not because they've figured something out, but because something in the dynamic made it possible to take that risk. But with change comes grief, because the roles, even the painful ones, gave us something. Predictability, control, a sense of who we were. Letting go of them means losing that. We grieve the way we used to make sense of things. We grieve the fantasy that the other person would read our mind. We grieve the version of the relationship that lived in our imagination. This grief isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It shows up in hesitation, in the way someone looks away when they say something true, in the way they reach for a hand they used to assume would be there. It's not always about letting go of the person. Sometimes it's about letting go of the version of yourself you became with them. Love isn't about fusion. It's about separation that doesn't threaten the bond. The philosopher Luce Irigaray wrote that true relationship requires space, an ethical distance where the other can remain other. Not a projection, not a role. Someone real with their own rhythm, their own story. Repair begins when that difference is allowed to live, without fixing it, without fearing it, without needing it to disappear. A breakthrough is rarely a moment of clarity. It's usually a moment of pause, the loops. The loop starts, someone withdraws, someone reaches, but this time something stalls. A phrase gets interrupted, a breath gets held, a habit doesn't complete itself. And suddenly there's a gap, a small one, but enough. What happens next is quiet. Someone does something unfamiliar, they stay. The old rhythm breaks, not loudly, not with insight, with discomfort. Maybe someone laughs at the wrong moment. Maybe someone cries and doesn't explain it away. Maybe there's a silence that lasts too long. These are the moments when the pattern doesn't get what it expects, when the relationship moves off script. That's the shift. But it doesn't feel good right away. Breakthroughs are disorienting. The partner who's used to caretaking doesn't know what to do when the other finally speaks with anger. The one who always needs space doesn't know how to stay when they're afraid. And the new self that shows up, the one that isn't defended or edited or managed, feels too exposed to last. But sometimes it does. The philosopher Stanley Cavell spoke of relationships as unfinished conversations. That's the work, staying inside the conversation long enough to let a different ending become possible. Not one where everything is solved, one where something real is said and no one runs. Sometimes the change is a small decision. Someone who always apologizes chooses not to. Someone who never asks for anything says, "Can you stay a little longer?" These aren't gestures of strategy. They're gestures of self. They carry risk. because the other might not respond, they might not even notice. But still, the question gets asked, and when someone does respond, when they hear the shift and meet it, even awkwardly, that's where repair begins. Not with harmony, with recognition, not with agreement, with adjustment. That's all most people need. Not to be understood completely, just to know their movement was felt. These moments don't fix things, but they change what's possible. The room feels different, the air settles, someone breathes a little deeper. And even though nothing has been resolved, something is now in motion that wasn't before. That motion is the work. And the work is what makes staying feel like a choice again. To love someone is to become part of what they carry. Not in a way that erases them, not in a way that saves them, but in a way that says, I see it. And I'm still here. That kind of presence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a plan. It arrives slowly, through listening that doesn't rush, through silence that doesn't abandon, through the decision to stay, not because it's easy, but because leaving would cost more. It's easy to confuse care with fixing, to jump in, to problem solve, to soothe away what's uncomfortable. But some things shouldn't be softened. Some pain needs room. Some anger needs to be heard all the way through. The most generous act is sometimes to hold the line and not interfere, to let the other fall apart without offering a solution. This is what makes presence different from performance. Performance wants to be seen. Presence allows the other to be seen. It doesn't need to prove anything. It doesn't flinch when the story is hard to hear. It doesn't pull away when the emotion doesn't resolve. That's not detachment, that's fidelity. Fidelity doesn't mean you always agree. It doesn't mean you always understand. It means you don't leave when understanding breaks down. You sit in the space where the story stops making sense and let it stay broken, not forever, just long enough for something else to rise from underneath. But presence costs something. It asks for attention, for time, for the willingness to not be the center. It asks that you don't interrupt, even when you think you know where the sentence is going. It asks that you don't translate someone's pain into something more comfortable, that you trust the shape it takes. Most of us have never been witnessed like that. We're used to being managed, evaluated, reassured. We're not used to someone staying close without rearranging the room. That kind of staying isn't passive, it's deeply active. It says, you can be all the way here and I won't correct it. And when that happens, when the feeling is allowed to land and the person doesn't retreat, something inside starts to settle. Not because it's fixed, but because it's finally been met, not judged, not redirected, just met. And that meeting, that moment of steady presence becomes the ground where repair begins. Not always with words, sometimes with nothing but a breath. What we call healing is often just learning how to stay with things we used to run from. Repair isn't about returning to how things were. It's about finding a way to keep going that doesn't repeat what hurt. That means letting go of roles we once relied on, roles that made us feel safe, that made us feel needed, that made us feel in control. When those roles no longer fit, something quiet breaks. And what comes after is uncertain. This is the part of relationship no one explains, the part after the conversation, after the apology, after the insight. It's not dramatic. It's the part where we decide again and again to live differently. Not because we've figured it out, but because the old way isn't working anymore. Most of what we carry isn't about what happened. It's about what wasn't named, what wasn't repaired, what was absorbed into the rhythm of daily life and mistaken for personality. That's what surfaces in conflict, not just frustration, but history, memory. The feeling of not being chosen, not being heard, not being allowed to be whole. That's why presence matters. Not because it's pleasant, but because it gives us a reference point, something to return to when everything inside says, leave. Presence doesn't make the pain go away, but it shows us the pain can be survived. Sometimes that presence shows up as a gesture, a hand on a shoulder, a repeated phrase. The smallest things become signals. I haven't disappeared. You're not alone in this. Other times, it's less clear. Someone stays quiet when they'd usually argue. Someone doesn't walk out of the room. It doesn't look like much, but it breaks the cycle, and that break is everything. It tells the nervous system, this moment is different. You're not back there, you're here. Repair doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be real, honest, repeated, Not performed once, but practiced over time. That practice isn't about becoming flawless, it's about becoming available. To try again when it's hard, to come back, not because you've forgotten the rupture, but because you're willing to hold it. It's not about trust being restored, it's about trust being redefined. The old trust said, "You'll never hurt me." The new trust says, "When hurt happens, we'll face it." That shift is quiet, but when it lands, everything starts to change. No one tells you that honesty can shake a relationship more than any betrayal. When someone finally says the thing they've been holding back about what they need or what they've stopped feeling or what they can't pretend anymore, it doesn't create clarity. It creates rupture. Not because it's wrong to speak, but because truth has weight. And when it lands, the shape of the relationship shifts. That's why so many people stay silent. Not out of deception, out of care. Out of fear, out of not knowing whether the truth once spoken will be something the relationship can survive. And sometimes it isn't. But sometimes the truth opens something, not right away, not without pain. But over time, if it's held, it can become the foundation for something more real. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas wrote about the face of the other as an interruption. That's what truth does in relationship. It interrupts. It says, "I'm not who you thought I was," or "I'm not who I pretended to be," or sometimes just, "I can't keep doing this." And in that moment, everything pauses. And what happens next depends on whether the pause is met with defense or with staying. Staying doesn't mean agreement. It doesn't mean immediate understanding. It means not disappearing, not minimizing, not trying to fix, just remaining in the room long enough for the impact to settle. That's what makes repair possible, not resolution, recognition. But recognition is work. It asks that you hear not just what was said, but what it meant. Not just the content, but the cost of saying it. Sometimes the person speaking needs nothing more than to know the moment landed, that they weren't dismissed, that they weren't too much. And sometimes the person hearing needs space to catch up, to feel their way through the implications. This is where the relationship can fracture or deepen. The line is thin. But when both people allow the truth to live between them, not explained away, not weaponized, something steady can begin to take shape. Not forgiveness, not certainty, but a kind of mutual clarity. We're both here now. And from this point on, we can't go back to how it was. What we build next has to include what's been said, what's been heard, and what's still being learned together in real time. What remains unsaid is often the most structural. Every relationship runs on rules no one talks about but everyone follows. Who apologizes first? Who goes quiet? Who gets to be upset? Who holds the weight when things go wrong? These aren't conscious choices. They're patterns, scripts picked up over time, rehearsed until they feel like personality. But they're not just personal. They come from somewhere, from families, from culture, from who's been allowed to have needs and who's been taught to swallow them. That's why relationships aren't just between two people. They're shaped by systems, gender, class, race, belief, history. What looks like personal tension is often structural inheritance. The philosopher Sylvia Wynter writes about how our identities are shaped by forces we don't always see. The same is true in intimacy. How we show up, how we love, how we withdraw, how we demand is shaped by what the world has made possible for us. And until we name that, we keep reenacting things we never chose. That's why repair isn't just emotional, it's also cultural. It means slowing down enough to see who got taught what, who's been carrying the emotional labour, who's had to perform calm, who's learned that being safe means being quiet. These aren't flaws, they're survival strategies. The work is learning to make space for them without letting them decide everything. Sometimes that means pausing the story, letting go of the question who's right and replacing it with what's happening here that's bigger than both of us. That shift doesn't make things easier, but it makes them more honest. It also makes clear that repair takes time. Not because people are stubborn, but because they're unlearning what once kept them safe. It won't be graceful. It won't be even. Some days it will look like nothing is happening. But if you stay with it, if you stay long enough to feel what's changing, you'll notice that the rhythm is different. Not fixed, just no longer on autopilot. That difference is everything. It doesn't guarantee the relationship will last. It doesn't mean trust won't be tested again. But it does mean the next rupture won't follow the same path. It means there's room now for difference, for delay, for something truer to unfold, not smoother, just more real. And sometimes that's the most anyone can offer. What remains always is the question of return, not the kind that means going back, but the kind that means showing up again, differently, after rupture, after silence, after the story has changed. It's the quiet decision to stay, not with certainty, not with resolution, but with a willingness to begin again inside something altered. Return isn't just presence, it's memory, the kind that carries what's been said, what's been broken, what's still unfinished. It doesn't erase rupture. It holds it like scar tissue, not as damage, but as record. To return honestly, something has to be given up. The old rhythm, the old role, the expectation that everything will feel the same. You come back, but the shape has shifted. There's more space now, or maybe just more silence. You learn to move inside it differently. Sometimes that silence is enough, not as avoidance, but as proof. Proof that something happened and that it mattered. The philosopher Hélène Cixous wrote that we are born again and again. Maybe in relationship we return again and again, not to the same place, but to the same question. Is it still possible to stay? And sometimes the answer isn't clear. You stay, you listen, you try. And sometimes that's as close as you ever get. Not because it's resolved, because it stayed, even when it didn't know how. Until next time.